Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Candidates Round 2 recap. Before I get into the video, I'd really appreciate if you went and subscribed to my YouTube channel. And also, I'd really appreciate if you followed my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/Stetus5. Okay, so now let's take a look at the games here. Let me pull them up. Okay, so I'm gonna start with this game between Ding Liren with the black pieces and Jan-Krzysztof Duda, the #1 Polish player with the white pieces. And I should note that Ding lost his first game with white against Jan Nepomniachtchi, so he was looking to make a comeback and trying to hopefully muddy the waters in this game so that he could play for a win. So the game started e4, e5, and eventually became an Italian, Gioco piano. So pretty standard so far, nothing too interesting. I think Ding's played setups with a6 and a5 before in the past. And here Ding plays this move queen b8, which is actually quite standard theory. This is the main move, even though it might look a little unnatural to the naked eye. But the idea is that the queen sneaks around to a7, usually, and teams up with the bishop to put pressure on f2. And that's what happened in the game. Rook e2, defending f2, a4, taking space, and now white plays knight g3. So in the meantime, while black is taking space on the queen side, white is usually aiming to start planting their knights on the king side and creating an initiative there. So here bishop d2, which was played in this game, is actually a novelty, and the main move is knight h4. And there are some games here. But bishop d2 was played by Duda, probably still preparation, he played it pretty quickly. So bishop b6 was played, queen c2, king h7, c4. Both sides are sort of slowly trying to improve their position. Queen a7, bishop c3, knight g8, rook d2. And here the first critical decision from Ding, which was to play the move c5. And at first this looks kind of anti-positional, because the bishop on b6 is now blocked by its own pawns. This bishop just simply isn't a very good piece, but you can always trade it off with bishop a5, and this locks down the center, so white can never play d4. Essentially, white's dark square bishop is equally bad compared to black's. It's also completely locked out by black's pawn structure of all dark square pawns. So rook f1 is played, c6, knight h2, Duda is preparing f4, f6 was played, rook e2, queen d7, bishop d2. Here Ding decided to play g5 because he was probably concerned about f4. Bishop d2 is pretty clearly preparing this move. But as it turns out, at least the computer thinks that f4 is not an issue. Black can play a natural move like knight e7, and now after f4, a trade and knight g6, and the black knight will land on e5, and f4 really just hasn't given white any play. They're just opening up the e5 outpost for black. So g5 was played in the game, and here Duda started to create counterplay. And for a while it seemed like Ding was the one who was playing for something, with moves like g5 and knight e7, knight g6, knight f4 coming. It seems like black is the one with all the play. But now Duda plays this rook b1 move, and suddenly after b4, white is creating a lot of counterplay on the queen side. And if here knight g6, then white has this move b5, and they're crashing through on the queen side once again. Knight f4, then white will just move the rook, and they can consider taking on c6 next if black allows it. So in the game, b4, a, b3 was played en passant. Rook b7, bishop c7, bishop e3, queen e8. Now black is preparing h5 to try to take an initiative on the king side. And white goes rook b7, queen d8. Here maybe queen c8 was a little better, because now after queen b1, black can go king g6 and stick to the plan of playing h5. And sort of no matter what, this is going to happen. Now you can go rook h8, defend the pawn. And white has some loose stuff. For instance, this would blunder rook a2. But in the game, queen d8 was played. And now after queen d1, h5 is no longer going to happen. So bishop c8 was played to kick the rook. Rook b3, queen e8. And now after rook eb2, h5 is once again just covered. So black struggles to create play here. Queen g6, knight f1, rook f7, queen e2, king g8, bishop d2. Now black tries f5, but after some trades, white is completely fine. The bishop is kicked out, and now white stops d5, so black is really just not getting any play here, and pretty quickly the players just made a repetition. Both sides sort of felt like there was no way to really improve the position here, because essentially black has the bishop pair, and it looks like they're doing well, but there aren't really any pawn breaks to go for, and white also just doesn't have any clear play. So a very solid and reasonable draw. Now, moving on to the next game, we have Richard Rapport and Alireza Firouzja. Two interesting players in this field. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more of them in the next games, because for both of them, it's their candidate's debut, and it's unclear how they'll do. Both of them were sort of struggling in round one, but they managed to survive with draws. So, okay. This game went e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and d4. And actually, surprisingly, when I looked this up in ChessBase, Rapport hasn't played d4 in 10 years. The last game he played with d4 was 10 years ago. So normally, Rapport chooses the Moscow with bishop b5. I believe that's what this is called. Yeah, and I think he's played some other things. Maybe he's played the closed Sicilian. I'm not really sure. But d4 was played, obviously the main line, but Rapport isn't a main line type of guy. So, yeah, and he didn't stick to the main line for very long. Here, knight d4 is pretty standard, which Rapport did play in that last game 10 years ago. But here he played queen d4, and he's never played this before, according to the database. So clearly something he prepared specifically for the candidates. And yeah, I mean, it's not shocking in the sense that Rapport does tend to play some offbeat openings. Alireza probably wasn't expecting this, though. So knight c6, bishop b5. Here Firouzja played a6. His only game in the database, a titled Tuesday game, here continued bishop d7, and I'll show some moves in that game. But in this game he chose a6, so we got take. Here white usually castled, but Rapport played c4, which is also fine, and e5, queen d3, knight e7. And here Rapport played a very interesting move, which actually is very similar to what Duda did against Rapport in round one, which I thought was very ironic. If you remember, Duda quite literally played the move 9c5 in a very similar pawn structure here in the round one game between those two players. So here c5 isn't as strong as in the Duda game. Duda basically got a winning position out of the opening, But c5 here is still very reasonable, and the same idea is present, which is you're trying to break up the pawn structure, and black can't take, because then e5 will be hanging. So c5 is actually a little uncommon. Usually white plays a move like knight c3 or castles, but c5 is fine. Knight g6 was played here. There was a game that continued d5 between Nakamura and Jeffrey Zhang. Knight takes e5, f6, knight f3, take, and some more moves were played. But knight g6 was played in this game, so we got a trade, and here bishop e3. And if you remember, this is quite similar to the Duda Rapport game, but for one, black's bishop is a little better here. Instead of being on g7, it's on d6, where it has potential to be a little more active. Essentially, this version is okay for black. It's just roughly equal. So a5 was played, castles, f6, and some more moves here. Both players sort of shuffling around, trying to improve the position. More or less, Firouzja at this point has achieved the best setup that he can get. His bishops are on active squares. He has a very solid pawn structure. He has this kind of one annoying weakness here of the c6 pawn, but it's pretty well defended. So rook d8. Again, some more moves here. Some shuffling around. Here, Rapport is starting to make progress. And he plays rook takes a3. And the idea is that after a trade, he's going to take with the b pawn, creating an outside passed a pawn, which is a little annoying. So Firouzja doesn't want that. He goes rook ba8. And now we get a trade. And here it seems like the momentum is shifting in Rapport's favor. It's still probably close enough to a draw, but white has a bishop versus a knight. And we should keep in mind also that not very long ago, black had a bishop pair, so both of their bishops were traded off. And white just has a small advantage, essentially. I mean, all these pawns are on dark squares, which later on, pretty far down the line, if some pieces get traded off, could be an issue. So rook b3, knight e6, rook b7, king g8, bishop e3, rook d8, f4, knight d4 check. This was maybe a questionable decision from Firouzja. As you can see, after this trade, this d4 pawn becomes very weak. And now it gets a bit difficult for black to make a draw. So king d2 was played, rook a1, and this is actually just a mistake. Firouzja is trying to defend this endgame in an active way, which sort of makes sense given Firouzja's style. He's definitely a player that strays more towards forcing options, and I think that's sort of more the modern way to play chess, which, you know, it makes sense for Ali Reza to go for since he's a modern player. He's the youngest player in the field. But here I'm not sure that it's correct, and this move is probably okay, but the computer doesn't like it, and it doesn't by any means force a draw. So here black can play passively, like h6 for instance, and here, let's say white goes king d3, tries to win this pawn. Now rook a1 is fine, because here you can give this check and now go rook h1, threatening to take with check. And here after d3, black is going to be able to make a perpetual. There are some other lines here. If rook b4 here, there's rook c8, which threatens c5, and now you hold these pawns together. If rook c7, attacking this pawn, there's rook b8, and if b4, rook a4, and we basically just trade off into a 3 versus 3. So basically rook a1 is not best, but it's still not easy, even though the computer gives white a pretty clear advantage, as you can see. So we get some trades, and this is sort of the key moment where Rapport made an inaccuracy, Both players didn't have a lot of time, so it's very understandable. But here, the easiest way to proceed is rook g7, king h8, and b4. And you get this b pawn rolling, even at the cost of losing your g3 pawn. And this looks annoying, but now the computer idea is to run the king away. And now you go rook d7 and collect the d pawn. And this endgame is just pretty much winning for white. Now the b pawn gets rolling, it's coming up the board very fast, and there's really just nothing black can do about it. So this probably would have given Rapport the win. But instead he plays the move e5. And now after trades, rook h3, king e4, rook g3, rook g7, we get trades. Rapport plays king f4, hitting the rook. We get a repetition, and now eventually Rapport rounds up the g6 pawn. But already it's quite hard for white to have any chance here. White goes e6. Here white could have also tried rook f5, which is interesting. And I should note that the reason I say that white struggles to win here is just basically because they've traded off all the pawns. And there's a famous saying that all rook endgames are drawn, but that is generally true a lot of the time. Usually when you see, you know, a 2 versus 1 in any kind of rook endgame, it's probably going to be a draw. So rook f5 was another try, but here we would have gotten a rook trade, and now black runs the pawn down the board, and if white tries to stop it, black can bring the king back, and now if we get this trade, so here, actually, if black takes on d2, it's a losing king and pawn endgame, but black can just wait, and you can't really defend e5. King e4, rook b4. If rook d4, you just take on b2, and here black rounds up the pawn. But it does go to show that there is definitely some precision required here. You can't just make any move with black and expect a draw. So in the game, e6 was played, rook e8 here. Here probably d3 is the easier way to draw, because now after e7 there's rook d4 check, which avoids the rook being captured in any line, and now white can't promote for the time being because the rook covers it. So now when white moves the king, black can play d2. Again, white can't promote, and black is threatening to promote. So white has to bring the rook back, and now this is just going to be a draw, because black is going to round up the pawn. And here the simplest way, I think if you take the pawn, then your king will be too far away from the b pawn, but you can just give checks with your rooks back and forth. And here I should mention that you can't go rook takes e7 here and then d2, because now in this endgame, once again, the king is just too far cut off, and this is a win for white. So you do have to be careful. But okay, so rook e8 is played, which still draws, but it's now getting a little complicated. So we got some checks. And here black plays rook e7, which is actually a losing move, but it's very unclear why that's the case. So d3 here is one way to draw. And now after white tries to give checks and win the rook, black can play king f6 at the end, and here you're just trading everything pretty much. There's just no way, you know, rook f7, you're going to get king e6, rook e8, king f7, if rook e8, king g7. Basically, white can't make any progress here, and they would be in danger if they try to, in some cases, because black's pawn is pretty close to promotion. Rook g8 apparently also draws according to the engine. So rook e7 was played, and here Rapport played b4. Apparently king f5 is winning according to the engine. So d3, here the engine on low depth suggests rook g3, but this actually leads to a draw. At the end, I believe the king gets back in time. I'm just going to go through the top engine line. I'm not going to try to explain this, but at the end, these pawns are just... the rook is stuck defending both these pawns, and white can't make any progress despite being up 2 pawns, which is actually pretty amazing. Sometimes in these types of positions, you can get some study-like ideas. By the way, sorry I haven't been checking chat, but hello everyone. Hey John. Hey Jan, how's it going? Yeah, I see you found the chat command. Let's see, rook g7. I'll go back to that position quickly. I mean, you can let me know what move that was. Okay, so let's go back. So king f5, d3, rook g1, d2. This is actually the winning line, I should say, according to the computer. Someone put this up on Twitter. And now rook h1, king g8, rook fh6. Now rook f2 is forced because white's threatening checkmate. So king e5, rook e2, king d6, rook h7 now, a crazy move, saying that if you take, I'm gonna queen. Or sorry, actually no, queens doesn't work, because then white's just gonna push the e-pawn at the end. So here there's actually the move rook e1, and now you can't stop black from promoting, which is pretty crazy. Yeah. And now, okay, so rook h7, rook g6, king h8. And here, apparently this wins for white. But, okay, again, all of this is pretty insanely complicated. Just very hard to come up with at the board. So, Rapport played b4, and now d3, rook g3, d2. And eventually everything gets traded, and the players make a draw, because black's king is close enough to the b-pawn. Black's just going to go rook b1, and then white won't be able to make progress at all. Pretty standard draw. But an opportunity missed for Rapport, who could have gotten off to a very good start and joined Nepo and Caruana in the lead. Speaking of Nepo and Caruana, they also played in round 2. So let's look at that game. So it was an Italian, actually a similar opening to the last game, or sorry, the Ding game. But I think in that game, Ding played a5, and this game continued a6, a4, bishop a7, rook e1, h6. Here are usually black castles. Sometimes h6 is included later, usually to prevent bishop g5 or knight g5. But in this case, Caruana played h6 for a different reason, which was to play g5. And this is a pretty crazy move, especially considering Caruana was playing black in this game. He was tied for first because he won his first game. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to take so much risk, but we'll see why Caruana went for this later on. Here Caruana played another game against another candidate, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, which continued knight h7. But in this game he chose g5. And here b4 was played, and Caruana plays knight g4, which is a new move, a novelty. So this has never been played before. In a previous game, Grishuk against Nepomniachtchi played knight e7 here. And I believe Nepomniachtchi ended up winning that game. It was on chess.com. In probably the Rapid Chess Championship or Title Tuesday, one of those events. I'm not sure. So knight g4 was played. And Caruana at this point was blitzing these moves. Queen f6, queen e1, queen g7, knight f1, castles, knight g3, knight e7. And here, Nepomniachtchi was clearly a little frustrated because Caruana was just playing all his moves instantly, and Nepomniachtchi, who's sort of known for playing really quickly, was actually down at some point, I think like 30 or 40 minutes in this game. And so he decided to mix things up here. He played the move d4, sacrificing a pawn, but trying to activate his pieces in the long run. And here he played the move rook a3. And Caruana said that he didn't expect this at all. This was not something he prepared. So at this point, Caruana started thinking on his own. Now the position's very complicated, and, you know, both players are out of prep. So he took on d4. Nepomniachtchi went h3, knight e5, bishop a2, and here Caruana played c5. We got a trade. Here Nepomniachtchi played the move rook b3. A lot of people thought he might just leave this rook out to dry on a3. So a move like queen d1, for instance, and now you're giving up the exchange, but this is still quite unclear because the d6 pawn is loose and these two bishops are actually pretty good. Which is kind of crazy because you are down 3 points of material. So it's definitely a little ballsy to go for this. So you played rook b3, just saving the rook. Now we got b5 with the idea take, then black's rook opens up. There's ideas of bishop e6, and a2 is loose. Also bishop a6 with skewering these two rooks if white takes on b5. So knight f5 was played, queen f6 here, king h2. And now basically black is saying that I'm giving up the a4 pawn, but I'm just going to bring all of my pieces over and try to go f4 or h4 or something to just get at your king, basically. So here, according to the computer, the best way to proceed was actually the move h4. And now after gh4, white goes rook h3. And after trading on f5, now if black plays a natural move like king h7, white can go rook e4 and just scoop up this pawn. But king h2 was played, ba4, rook g3, king h7. Now queen d1 was played. Essentially, Nepomniachtchi is attacking the a4 pawn. The queen also has vision over here, maybe getting to h5 at some point. So bishop d7 was played, rook c2, and now you can see Nepomniachtchi is preparing this queen h5 idea. So you got take, rook a b8, and queen h5. And from a practical perspective, this is very dangerous. Even though Caruana is up 2 pawns, they're over here on the queen side, they're doubled, and Nepomniachtchi is the one whose pieces are active. In fact, he's immediately threatening to take on g5, so rook g8 is forced. And now bishop b2 was played, and here there's a pretty amazing winning move, which, maybe not winning, but it gives black a significant advantage. 2000 before you, yeah. Yeah, I actually played a tournament last night, or finished a tournament, because it was every Monday, and I gained some rating. My current live rating is 2068, so I guess I might need to update that command. Yeah, and I'm actually hoping to play tonight also at the Marshall Chess Club. If you guys ever go to New York City, I recommend checking out the Marshall Chess Club. There's a lot of good tournaments here. Anyway, getting back to the game, here the winning move is rook takes b2. And I gave this a double exclamation point. I don't know if it really deserves that, but I just think this is a very weird idea. I mean, I think it's kind of crazy as a human to come up with this, Because basically you're giving up an exchange to alleviate white's kingside play. Because this bishop is really annoying, basically. It threatens things on the diagonal, most of all taking on e5, and then when it goes to c1, it's threatening to take on g5, and basically you're just getting rid of it. But not for any tactical reason. You can't go knight g4, knight f3, because then f7 is going to be loose. So basically you're just giving up an exchange, and now the computer line here is bishop f2, and after rook a3, d5, and the black queen is coming to d6 next. But, I mean, I can't say I really understand this as a human. It just doesn't feel right to give up an exchange like this. But apparently it's correct. And I'm not sure that Caruana saw this. I'm assuming he did, but didn't think it was worth the risk. So he played in the game rook g8, but now white has bishop c1, and rook g8 is forced, bishop b2, rook ge8, and we get a draw by repetition. So a very exciting game, but it did end in a draw. Okay, now on to the last game of round 2. This was between Hikaru Nakamura and Timur Radjabov. And Nakamura was hoping to win this game because he got off to a bad start with a loss in round 1. And Radjabov is sort of the target in this field, in my opinion. I think a lot of the players are hoping to beat him in their white games. Because Radjabov came off of a pretty disastrous result in Norway chess recently, where he lost a bunch of games with the black pieces. And it's looking like he's a little less well prepared than a lot of the other guys in this field. So this game went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, Berlin here. I should mention that if you look in the database, a ton of Hikaru's games recently have come from this Berlin draw line. Obviously, he wasn't going to play this today, or in round 2 in the candidates, because you're trying to win with white, so why would you take a draw? But yeah, so in this game he went d3, bishop c5, knight bd2, and this is a move that Hikaru usually doesn't play. He sometimes plays c3, and Radjabov actually lost 2 games on the black side of this, I believe, in Norway chess. So I think a lot of people were expecting this. And Hikaru's played this before. But knight bd2, knight d4. So we got sort of a rare line here. And Hikaru played d4 here, which is an interesting idea. Black doesn't really want to take, because now after e5, if you take on c3, I'm assuming Hikaru is planning on just taking, and even though white's down a pawn here, they have a lot of space in the center, and it's very sharp. And Radjabov probably didn't want to go for this because, you know, Hikaru was probably well prepared if he chose to play this line. So it's probably something he looked at in depth. So instead, Radjabov played c6. We got a bunch of trades. And here, Nakamura played queen h5, which was clearly his prep. He had a game that continued knight f3 here. And that one, I believe, petered out to a draw. But here he chose queen h5. So queen c6 was played. And there was a recent game in the Speed Chess Championship, which continued knight f3 here. Between Nepomniachtchi and Aronian. But Nakamura prepared rook e1. We got rook e8, knight f3. And here the move d5 was played by Radjabov. And I should point some things out about this position. So first of all, black can't play d6 because now there's just knight g5 with the double attack. So that's a threat. And also rook takes e4, and now bishop d2. This is very dangerous for black because white's threatening knight g5, Plus, they have ideas of just taking on e4 and then going rook e1 and occupying the file if black plays something like h6. So h6 immediately is sort of the best way to play, seemingly, because it deals with knight g5. But maybe it's still a little unpleasant. Here white can go bishop e3 and d6. They can trade, and probably black's fine here if they find this idea of going a5 and b4 and breaking up the pawn structure. I think this was what some of the commentators were expecting to happen, but instead Radjabov plays this sharp move d5. And here queen takes d5 is playable. It's just a pawn up endgame. But it's probably not much. After these trades, bishop f5, and now rook e8 is coming pretty quickly. And white can go bishop f4 and d6. This is probably what Nakamura should have gone for, because it's not clear that this is winning for white, but at least the pawn survives. And it's something. There are definitely chances for white to convert with the extra pawn here. So instead, Nakamura chose e takes d5, and now we got a trade and queen c4. So now this queen's getting active. There could be a queen e2 at some point, maybe combined with bishop g4 first. And so h3 is played to avoid that. Bishop e3 was also possible, because this bishop's very annoying, so you basically just want to trade it off. This was a possible line here, king h1, rook e8, h3, something like this, and trading, and then white can go d6 and preserve their extra pawn. But okay, in the game h3 was played, so bishop d7 now. Here, queen e4 is also possible. And now on knight f3, bishop f5. So this square is opened up. But okay, Radjabov plays bishop d7, queen f3 here. And now rook e8 and bishop e3. This is necessary. You have to trade these bishops at some point. So this was a good move by Nakamura. You can't go knight c2 first and then bishop e3 to not damage your pawn structure, because now there's rook e2 and b3 rook takes f2, taking advantage of this annoying discovered check. So also there's bishop f4, that's another option, but again, it's really important to trade off this bishop. So take. Rook e5 was played here. Probably it makes more sense to just go b4 and start trying to trade off pawns. After a trade, knight d3. Here on queen d2, there is e4, and a lot of people were looking at this possibility. Now white just solidifies their pawn structure. There's also rook d1 too, and black can't take because now knight c5 and this pawn will promote. So b4 though still was probably the best option. And now after rook e5, d6 is played. Here rook d1 was best, with the idea if queen a2, now there's knight d3, rook d5, e4. And Nakamura, I think, said in the game that he was worried about rook f5, but now there's rook d4, rook f3, rook c4, rook e3, rook c7, allowing the knight to be captured, but now you have king f2 and rook e7, d6, which wins. So this is a very nice line, but not so easy to see in a game. There are some other options, like, okay, here there are a lot of blunders possible, like queen a2 if e4 right away, then black starts winning pawns, and you can even win the exchange, but this isn't so clear. And if in this position knight c5 is played, there's the important move bishop c6, which is why you have to go e4 first and then knight c5. So a lot of things to calculate here. And d6 is played. Now queen d5. And if bishop c6 was played, this was probably the best option for Radjabov. Now if white just plays queen g3, there's queen d5, centralizing the queen, hitting this pawn, putting pressure on g2. And already here, the computer actually prefers black, despite black being down a pawn. So Nakamura, that is, sorry, probably would have had to play d7 and liquidate here. But now after bishop c6, the rook is covering back rank checks, and black is really activating all their pieces, and there are some scary ideas looming here. So queen d5 was played in the game, and now we got some trades, and objectively this endgame should be roughly balanced. Here Radjabov played h5, which was probably the wrong approach. You want to play g5 and try to fix these pawns on light squares. And now you can go for h5, h4, and it's sort of hard for white to do what they want with these kingside pawns. But now after h5, white goes h4 and g3, and now these pawns are untouchable by the light square bishop. So king f7, king f2, king g6, we get some more moves, and here Radjabov makes a decisive mistake. Here you can basically make any move with the bishop, like bishop g4, and black is completely fine because the rook is just holding their two weaknesses. They should be a little worse, but really there's just no way for white to do anything here. And in the game though, Radjabov played the move rook d5, but now after rook c6, here white just wins a pawn. And now it's a lot harder for Radjabov to draw the game. He might still have chances, and we get some shuffling around. Nakamura is slowly trying to improve the position. And now he finally goes a3. And this is an interesting move. Basically, his idea now is that he wants to go knight d4 and take on b5, but he doesn't want to allow rook takes h4 and rook h2 winning his a pawn. So that's what happens. And once again, if we had this position with the pawn still on a2, then there would be rook h2 check. But rook h2 is played anyway. Hey, Metal Eagle, how's it going? I hope you're doing well. All right, so king g3, rook d2, c4. Now white's getting their pawns going. And now it's sort of just a matter of technique. So rook h1 here. Nakamura plays king g2. There's an option of a couple squares to put the king on. This one is not the best. King f4 is the best square because now king g5 is just prevented. Black's king cannot be activated easily. And so rook b1 is possible. Now the pawn's just going to march up the board. And if h3, king g3. Here, if rook g1, a5, h3, rook h8, basically no matter what, this pawn is not the biggest danger in the position. If rook c1, a5, h3, once again, king g3. So no matter what, basically this king f4 move has everything under control. King f2 is also winning, actually. And this is sort of because of a deeper idea, which is when you go down this entire line here, and by the way, black can't take on a6 because then the c-pawn is going to promote. So black has to try to push their h-pawn, but they're just not in time, and white queens with check. But in the game, if we had gone into this line with king g2, rook b1 here actually probably draws the game. And it's hard to say, obviously, looking at these lines with engines. on low or higher depth. You're not really sure what's drawing and what's winning, but this seems to hold the draw. With that same idea that now if you go down this line, there's h3, and now black gives a perpetual. And again, the difference, if the king's on f2, now h3 doesn't come with check, and you can promote. So very small difference, very hard to understand. And here rook d1 is also possible, but a5, king h5, king f2 should win. That's similar to what happened in the game. Here, Nakamura played the move king f2. And the reason that this is so strong is because you're stepping out of h3 check ideas, which is definitely important. And also you're sort of baiting the move king g4 because essentially black doesn't have a clear way to improve their position here. There just aren't really any good moves. You sort of have to keep the rook glued to the c-pawn, and your bishop can't really go anywhere helpful. You know, you want to maybe keep an eye on these pawns over here. Essentially, there's just no move that is really helpful here for black. Now, if white plays a6 here, there's rook a1, and this pawn's sort of getting stopped. And if rook f8, black simply goes king g6. So the deep idea of this move is now king g4, there is rook f8, and you're just winning the f6 pawn. And now, simply up 2 pawns, it's just over. And Radjabov tries something desperate here with h3, but Nakamura just takes the bishop. Here he could have also tried bishop c4, but now after this trade, the a-pawn's simply too fast. And this is winning. So we got some more moves, but this is a pretty easy win as long as you just stop the h-pawn. And here Radjabov resigned. So that's it for the round 2 recap. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And I might make a round 3 recap pretty soon. We'll see. But for now, that's it. So, yeah. Thanks for tuning in. I'll go ahead and send the raid to Josh Price, and see you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in.